Hey everybody, how's it going? Today is part 3 of our 351 build, and we are going to start by getting our cylinder heads all checked out. We're going to check the valve guide clearance, set our spring heights, and then we're going to vacuum test all the valves before assembly to make sure that everything is sealing correctly and that we can reuse these valves with these seats. First, what I'm going to do is get the outside diameter of our valves and see how concentric we all are to each other. Basically make sure all the valves are the same diameter, none of them are too tight or a different diameter than the others. We'll do all the exhausts first. Okay, these all feel really good. However, these two are just slightly larger in diameter just by feel. So I'm now going to set my dial bore gauge to the diameter, and I'll go through and check all the exhaust clearances, and if I have two that are a little larger, a little wider clearance than the others, we know to put these two valves into those valve guides. Okay. Okay, this one is a little bit looser. So is this one. All right, so I'm gonna put these valves with those guides. And now we're going to do the same process for our intake valves. Next, we'll lubricate our valve stems and go ahead and install the valves. I just do a little dash of assembly lube on the valves themselves. Next, what we're going to do is check all the spring heights and see what pressures we have to make sure these springs are going to work with the new camshaft and its valve lift. So we'll start down here, set our gauge. Let's see what we got. 1.80. I'll write that down real quick. And I'm going to do this for all of the intakes, and then I'll come back and do all of the exhaust valves. And you can do a lot of this just by feel. If the gauge has the exact same pressure going in underneath the retainer, it'll be within about 5 thou, which is within our tolerance of how far these can be in spec. So far, they all feel the exact same, which is good. Okay, I checked them. I want to make sure the gauge didn't move. Perfect. Now we're going to come back and check the exhaust and do the same thing. The exhausts are much shorter on this cylinder head with these retainers and valves. So I need to reset up my little gauge here. Get another measurement to confirm. That one was a little different. And remeasure this one. I lost my other retainer. There it goes. There we go. Okay. So those are at 1.64. Alrighty. Now we'll come over to our spring tester. And we'll figure out what our pressures are going to be. We'll start with the exhaust since I already have my gauge set to there. And we'll put the exhaust spring in. And I like to do it with the retainer. I guess on this one, because it's a single, it really doesn't matter. So we'll put our spring in. And I always leave a little bit hanging over. Put our mic there. We'll measure our seat pressure, which from my angle, I'm getting right at, oh, it would help if this was tight. So 1.64 was our measurement. Let's try that again. Okay, I'm getting right at 60 pounds on this spring. We'll go ahead and check the rest of them. All right, next, we'll look at our cam card and see what our valve lift is. And our exhaust valve is going to open up 473 thou. So I just take my caliper and I zero it out. Battery's blinking because it's about to die. And I'll go into 473. That's close enough. Now we'll check the open pressure. Right at about 205, 210. And we're going to check all of these as well. Okay, all of our exhaust valves have measured within 5 pounds of each other for their closed and open pressures. And so now I'm going to re-zero at our valve lift, and I'm going to take the spring to coil bind and see how much clearance we have. And we have 126 thou coil bind clearance, which is plenty. So we know all of our exhaust springs are good and will work. Now we'll do the same procedure for the intake springs. So we've got our mic re-zeroed. I'm gonna open it up to 1.8, which was our open height on the intakes. Lock it down. And we'll check pressures. Again, if you're doing a double spring, you need to do it with the retainer, because the retainer will have a step in it that it will use to activate that second spring, the inner spring. So, but because we're using singles, we can just put them straight up and we won't see any difference. So let's check our closed pressure. I'm getting about 70 pounds. Okay. Again, we'll re-zero, and our intake valve opens up 449 thou. So we'll open up our valve. Come on. You are not wanting to cooperate. That's close. There we go. And we'll repeat. Check the open pressure. And the reason I'm doing this is to make sure that none of our springs are weak from age and mileage. Because this boat has such a low RPM, it's not as crucial as if we were building a drag race engine that's going to turn 8,500 RPM. But nonetheless, we still want to make sure we have a healthy valve train that can last for many, many miles. And our pressures are perfect for this camshaft, and being that it's a flat tappet, that's only going to have, I think, a 4,500 RPM limit, I think is what the owner said. And the last spring, we'll check it. All right, they all have the same pressures, and again, we'll re-zero, unlock our caliper, coil bind the valve spring. Same story, we have miles of clearance. So, these heads are ready to go. I'm gonna put the valve stem seals on them next. We'll do a quick pressure check on all the ports, make sure the valves are holding pressure, and then we can be clear to assemble them. For these heads going on this application, I'm gonna use umbrella style valve stem seals. And the reason for that is because this is a marine engine, it's going to be at heavy loads for very extended, long periods of time. If you're pulling a wakeboarder, you could potentially be at your full RPM, full load, and if he knows what he's doing, you could be there for 10, 15 minutes. And so because of that, we want to let a little extra oil come through the valve gear, come through the valves, and get a little extra lubrication. Versus if we did a positive stop, they're a little better at controlling oil flow and restricting it. But for this engine, these are going to be perfect. Okay, Now that we got the valves and the valve seals in, we're gonna take our little new in vacuum gauge checker dude and do a quick vacuum check. Now that we have everything pressure checked, the heads are healthy, the valve guide clearance is correct, the springs are good, we'll go ahead and put these together. Okay, we're back over at the engine. We're gonna go ahead and install all of our lifters, get them lubricated, and then we'll get the heads ready to be installed. Because these are flat tappet, we're gonna install a very generous amount of lubrication on these lifters, because we do not want these to go flat on us and tear the cam up while we're trying to break in the valve train. I'm going to go ahead and install new head dowel pins first, and then we'll lay our head gaskets on and bring over the cylinder heads to be installed. For head gaskets, I'm using the Felpro PT1s 9333s. If you notice on the block, it has coolant passages running all the way down it. However, we want the coolant to circulate all the way to the back of the block, come up through the head, and then travel back across the head. So on our head gasket, you'll see there's no coolant passages here, but there are coolant passages in the back, and these holes get progressively larger going to the rear of the engine. That way the coolant is forced to go through the block all the way and then come back up through the head. I'm going to get some anti-seize put on our bolts, and then we'll start torquing down the cylinder heads. When I use the anti-seize, I put some on the threads of the bolts, and I also put it underneath the head of the bolts. And the purpose of the anti-seize is to let the bolt stretch into the threads with very little friction so that we get a proper torque reading when we go to torque the head. If there was friction on the threads, our torque wrench would not measure correctly. So by using the anti-seize, we eliminate any unnecessary friction. Because these bolts don't have a washer and are going to be going onto the paint, I'm going to run these in by hand instead of using the impact gun. First, I'm going to torque these to 40 foot-pounds, then 70, then final torque at 100. And then instead of putting a blue line on all the bolts, I'll just do a cross on the back so that I know that I have torqued these down. Makes it a little cleaner because you'll actually see this part of the engine, whereas inside you won't see all those blue lines everywhere. It is a new day and I am about to start working on the 351 Marine engine again. I'm gonna measure the push rod length, make sure the valve train looks good, and then we'll go ahead and I will finish up torquing the valve train down, get the intake manifold set on, bolt the water pump up, and this engine will be just about done. On these factory Ford push rods, to help save money, they would only heat treat one end of the push rod, and that's the end that is wearing on the rocker arm as the rocker, rocks on it. So whenever you're putting these back together, this painted side needs to go up towards the rocker arm. So I am going to get all these installed. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be checking the push rod length, make sure these are going to work with this engine. And I will go from there. Get one of my rocker arms. Okay, take this one to 0 lash. And then I'm going to take my torque wrench, set to 22 pounds, and see how many rotations it takes to torque itself. Okay. So we still have play in the bottom. So these push rod, the intake push rods will work. Rotate it over and check the exhaust push rods. Loosen that real quick. Again, take it to 0 lash. Okay, these are going to work. I'm gonna go ahead and get the rest of them set up, lubricated, and get this valve train assembled. Now the intake manifold is ready to be installed. And because these heads are used and just a little porous, I'm going to use ultra black sealant around all the coolant ports. And then I would just go back and touch up the corners a little bit with the small gun. This intake manifold is solid iron and is not light. There we go. Definitely a heavy boat engine. There it is, 351 marine engine, rebuilt, ready to go.